Hey guys. Tonight we're heading into the thick of Victorian London. Not through the usual gas lamp-lit alleyways of murder mysteries and chimney sweeps, but into the far more dangerous realm of women's hair accessories. You may think you're safe, bundled under your covers, but you're about to wander into a world where steel hairpins were both fashion statement and public menace. A world where respectable ladies accidentally stabbed each other while boarding omnibuses. And where London newspapers warned of the hairpin menace, as if it were a contagious illness. You probably won't survive this, not if you're wearing a top hat near a ladies' coach bench. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake by the end, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it in your part of the world? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along Fleet Street just as the first coal carts start rattling in. The fog is thick today, so dense you can barely see your own boots. It clings to your coat, settles in your nostrils, and carries the scent of ash, cabbage, and something faintly medicinal. A milk cart sloshes by, and two boys in flat caps yell across the road with cheerful vulgarity, though their words dissolve into the fog before reaching your ears. As you pass a corner lamppost, something flashes in the gray, a glint of polished steel. Then a yelp, a woman shrieks, "Mind your head," and a gentleman clutches at his temple, bleeding from a surprisingly precise point above the ear. He had bowed too quickly, it seems, and collided with a young lady's coiffure. The weapon? A well-secured but unfortunately angled steel hairpin. You keep walking. This is not unusual. By the late 1840s, hairpins had transitioned from hand-forged novelties to factory-made staples. Made of steel or brass, they were sleek, sharp, and plentiful. Women wore them by the dozen. Some styles required up to 30 to hold everything in place. Not only did hairpins help support massive updos, but they also doubled as silent signals. Different placements could suggest availability, marital status, or that one was off to a funeral. Victorian society communicated in layers, and hair was no exception. The clatter of boots on stone accompanies you to a tea shop where the display window features a mannequin head with hair so tightly wound it could deflect musket fire. Dozens of pins hold it in place, shining faintly under the shop's gaslights. A chalkboard sign reads, "Secure Elegance, 6p a set." Here's a curious detail. Most women carried extra hairpins on their person. Not in a pouch or box, but tucked in sleeves, gloves, or boots, emergency backups in case of wind or scandal. Some even sharpened them deliberately. Fashion collided with preparedness, and like so much else in the Victorian era, it all seemed terribly proper until someone lost an eye. Historians still argue whether the hairpin panic truly qualified as a panic in the sociological sense or merely a media-fueled nuisance. But one thing is clear. You couldn't go more than a few blocks in London without seeing someone being poked, prodded, or politely threatened by a lady's updo. You turn onto a quieter street and find a newspaper boy shouting headlines. His voice cracks, and he gestures toward a crumpled broadsheet in your hand. Gentleman hospitalized by rogue hairpin. I nearly lost. You read the fine print. The incident occurred during a crowded omnibus ride, where sudden braking caused a domino of passengers to collide. Somewhere in the chaos, one particularly sharp pin made its mark. Doctors reportedly extracted the item, with no small difficulty and a quantity of fainting. Londoners, with their ever-growing population and cramped quarters, were no strangers to strange injuries. But the hairpin presented a uniquely dainty danger, hidden, silent, unexpected. It was almost funny. Almost. You pass a group of ladies at the dressmaker's, gossiping animatedly. One waves a hand to emphasize a point and accidentally pokes her friend's cheek with her own hair arrangement. There's a startled squeak, then laughter. No blood this time, just another minor jab in the battle of Victorian fashion. Back then, women weren't supposed to carry weapons. That was improper, masculine, threatening. But hairpins? Those were accessories. Perfectly legal, widely accepted, and theoretically harmless. Until they weren't. That's what made them both frightening and strangely empowering. Some historians have likened the Victorian hairpin to the Swiss Army knife. Not only did it hold your curls in place, but it could unlock drawers, pick fruit, scratch out an address in a fogged-up window, and, if necessary, stab a would-be groper on the underground. A few clever women reportedly carried pins dipped in pepper oil, just in case. By now, you've circled around to the Thames. The fog hangs lower here, hugging the damp railing. A boat bell rings in the distance. You pause, leaning over to watch a barge drift by, its deck piled high with crates and, bizarrely, a hat rack. You blink. Hanging from the rack, dozens of glinting hairpins. Bent, scorched, and clearly salvaged. Someone's business, perhaps, or someone's warning. As the city wakes up and street lamps flicker off, you're left with a strange sense of both menace and absurdity. All this fuss over hairpins. And yet, in a city known for its coal-choked skies and endless rows of chimney pots, it somehow fits. The fog thins a bit as the sun nudges above the slate roofs, casting a pale glow over chimney stacks and church spires. You follow the sound of hooves echoing off stone as a delivery cart rattles past, its driver half asleep, a roll of newspapers bouncing beside him. Your boots scrape over cobblestones still slick from the night's condensation. Somewhere ahead, a bell rings, shopkeeper opening early. And across the street, you spot a milliner's shop, its display window crammed with bonnets, feathers, and yes, hairpins, dozens of them, rows upon rows like miniature javelins. The rise of the hairpin was never part of some grand design. It happened quietly. At first, women relied on handmade pins, often curved or looped at the ends to prevent poking. But with the industrial boom of the 1830s and 40s, steel wire became cheap. Hairpins started rolling off assembly lines by the thousands. Some came with engraved stems. Others were advertised as rust-proof, reversible, or gentle for scalp. It was a golden age for headgear. One Birmingham factory reportedly produced 500,000 hairpins per day. The things multiplied like rabbits. By 1855, they were considered an essential purchase, listed right alongside soap and stockings in women's shopping guides. Stores sold them in flat tin boxes, often with cheerful slogans like "Secure Your Grace" or "Hold Fast and Flourish." Victorians did love a motto. Here's something most people don't realize. Hairpins weren't just popular among the wealthy or stylish. Even working-class women kept a stash. They were portable, cheap, and practical. A barmaid in Southwark once told a reporter she used hers to fix a leaky ale tap. Another claimed her pin once fished a guinea out of a gutter. But convenience came with complications. The designs got sharper, thinner, more precise, and as hairstyles reached impossible heights, braids wrapped into crowns, buns like coiled snakes, the pins needed to anchor it all grew longer and stiffer. A popular updo in 1862 required an average of 22 steel pins and could reportedly deflect small thrown objects. You stroll into a quiet courtyard, where a washerwoman wrings out her linens. She eyes you, then drops her gaze to your shoes, muddy. As expected, she tuts, turns back to her line, and you notice her hair, tightly braided, pinned back in a loop with 3 visible steel rods glinting in the light. She probably put them in before dawn, and they'll stay there until sunset. She doesn't smile, but she does nod. You nod back, and keep walking. It's worth noting that men at the time viewed hairpins with a blend of amusement and unease. Some laughed them off as harmless frippery. Others whispered warnings about improper ladies, hiding messages in their updos or using pins to gouge eyes in alleyways. A few newspapers even published satirical cartoons, elegant women fencing with hairpins, or dueling like musketeers, one bun unraveling mid-lunge. And the stories started stacking up. A gentleman on the Brighton Express leaned too close during conversation and came away with a pierced earlobe. Another slipped while helping his sister out of a carriage and spent a week with a pin lodged in his shoulder. The more hairpins found their way into the urban sprawl, the more the city seemed to bristle. One 1851 editorial in the London Mercury warned of a steel epidemic, and proposed a gentleman's hat band infused with cork for protection. Another columnist insisted that any woman carrying more than 5 visible pins should be asked for her domestic intentions. This same article compared pins to lady daggers. It was meant to be funny. But then again, maybe it wasn't. Historians still debate the exact moment when concern gave way to paranoia. Some point to 1854, when a member of Parliament joked, half seriously, that hairpins should be registered like firearms. Others believe it started earlier, when Queen Victoria herself reportedly required all guests at Balmoral to remove metal pins before dinner, after one supposedly fell into the soup. Whether these events were entirely true is beside the point. The gossip spread, and with it came caution. Gentlemen took to sitting at an angle during theater performances. Schoolmasters warned boys not to pull girls' braids, lest the pins bite back. Even etiquette manuals, usually reserved for teacup placement and glove etiquette, began advising women to consider the safety of others when securing elaborate coiffures. You pass a row of townhouses now, their brick fronts stained with soot. A window is cracked open. Inside, a governess is pinning her hair while 3 children sit cross-legged behind her. Watching in fascination, she catches you watching her watching them and offers a brief, tired smile. Then, click, 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 the pins slide into place. A fortress once more. Every corner of London seemed to have its own opinion about hairpins. Dressmakers adored them. They made styles possible that otherwise would collapse. Carriage drivers loathed them, so many sudden jabs and apologies. And barbers? Oh, they had opinions. One angry letter to a local journal declared hairpins a masquerade of menace, claiming he had nearly swallowed one while trimming a fringe. Metal in the mouth is no way to meet God, he wrote. And still, the pins kept coming. You reach a bench near Kensington Gardens and settle for a moment, listening to the distant clip-clop of hooves and the rustling of early leaves. A girl walks past with her nursemaid, humming softly. The top of her head sparkles faintly, 6, maybe 7 pins forming a tiny starburst. She's barely 10, and already armed. By the time the hour chimes from a distant church tower, you're left wondering how a little scrap of steel came to dominate an entire city's imagination. But it did, and tomorrow, it might again. You rise from the bench as the park begins to stir, nannies pushing prams. A few ambitious joggers in curious woolen outfits. And a vendor setting up a cart of roasted chestnuts. Your boots crunch on the gravel path as you head toward the gates. Back toward the city streets where the real mischief always waits. Just as you pass a wrought iron fence, you hear a sudden burst of clanging. A constable has dropped his walking stick, and it skitters across the stones, nearly tripping over a passing woman whose hat teeters precariously. A gust of wind catches it, and there it goes. The hat sails through the air, pirouettes like a startled bird, and lands directly on your shoulder. It's lovely, wide-brimmed, feathered, and heavy. You hand it back with a polite nod. But as the woman secures it back in place, you notice the telltale glint of steel just under the ribbon. 3 hairpins, long as knitting needles, slide smoothly back into her bun. She mutters thanks and hurries on. This is not unusual. The unspoken danger of Victorian fashion wasn't that women wore hairpins, it was that everyone knew they did. And no one could quite agree on how to feel about it. And so, people talked, loudly, repeatedly, especially in newspapers. By the mid-1850s, you couldn't crack open a broadsheet without stumbling upon a hairpin story. The Morning Chronicle featured a recurring column called Street Perils, which, more often than not, ended up reporting on minor hairpin injuries. Boy poked in ear while selling chestnuts. Read one. Another, more dramatic. Clergyman confuses hairpin for insect, requires assistance. A few editors began publishing satirical pieces. One suggested the formation of a society for the prevention of undue violence. Still, not everyone laughed. Some readers took it seriously, especially as incidents involving stolen hairpins increased. It started small, a pin here, a set there, but then came the heists. Real, organized thefts. A notable case in 1857 involved two sisters who operated a modest boarding house in Clerkenwell. Their guests, mostly young shopgirls, began to complain of missing pins. At first, no one paid much attention, but when the thefts grew bolder, entire boxes taken from drawers, someone notified the constables. A sting was set up, and the culprit turned out to be a young boy who had been smuggling the pins out in his hatband and selling them to a rag and bone man for a fraction of a penny each. That should have been the end of it, but the press had a field day. Hairpin thief strikes again. Clerkenwell terror nabbed. London's ladies left exposed. Historians still argue whether these reports were blown out of proportion by an eager media or whether they reflected a real, widespread issue. Either way, the coverage sparked a strange chain reaction. Women began hiding their pins. They wrapped them in scarves, disguised them in glove linings, or twisted them deep into braids where light wouldn't catch. Some even developed small customs, tapping their hair twice before sitting down, or shaking out their skirts to make sure no pins had loosened. But that didn't stop the stories. In fact, it made things worse. One report from 1858 describes a young gentleman who, after escorting a lady through Covent Garden, arrived home with a pin still lodged in his coat collar. He didn't notice until morning. "I believed myself attacked by a parasite," he wrote in a letter to the Times, only to discover it was a token of courtship, or perhaps warfare. The thefts grew more creative. One man was caught with 200 hairpins stitched into the lining of his overcoat. Another reportedly disguised himself as a lady's maid to gain access to a wealthy widow's boudoir, where he made off with 2 boxes of pearl-headed pins. When caught, he claimed he had a sincere admiration for ornamental metallurgy. The judge was not impressed. You pause outside a tobacconist's window, catching your reflection in the glass. Behind you, a woman adjusts her shawl and leans in to whisper something to her friend. Both laugh. One discreetly taps the back of her head. The other nods. It's almost like a secret language. All these gestures, one developed to keep pins secure. but also to keep watch. At this point in the story, you're probably wondering, what were the actual laws regarding hairpins? Well, here's the thing, there weren't any. Not formally. The Victorian legal system did not classify hairpins as weapons, and they weren't illegal to carry. But when incidents piled up, injuries, thefts, and what one alderman referred to as unexpected punctures, some city councils proposed bizarre ordinances. One idea floated by a district magistrate involved a maximum allowable length. Another suggested requiring women to carry a pin pouch, so extra pins wouldn't be stored in sleeves or bonnets. Neither regulation gained traction, but they stirred debate. Letters to the editor rolled in, mostly from women, sarcastically asking whether teacups would be measured next, or if corsets would require licenses. A prominent suffragist, Lady Frances Derby, famously mocked the proposed restrictions in a speech. She appeared on stage with an enormous hat adorned with 16 exaggerated pins, each tipped with a tiny white flag. "I surrender," she declared, "to your reasonable fear of hair and independence." And still, the public fascination grew. The hairpin, once a background player in the costume of daily life, had become a headline act. As you stroll past an alleyway where laundry drips from windows above, a cat scurries across your path, pausing to stare with disapproval, perhaps offended by your lack of ornamentation. You're unarmed. After all, no pins in your hair, no steel in your pocket. It makes you feel just a bit exposed. Because in Victorian London, you never quite knew when a fashion trend might poke back. By the time you reach Ludgate Hill, the morning has swelled into its usual chorus, carriage wheels screeching, newspaper boys shouting, the low hum of thousands of boots against damp stone. But there's something else in the air today. An edge, a rustle of tension that comes not from politics or poverty, but from the curious fear that someone, somewhere, might be just a bit too well armed with steel in her hair. You duck into a bakery for a moment, mostly for the warmth, but also for the smell of cardamom buns and treacle loaves still steaming on their trays. The baker, a ruddy-faced man with flour on his sleeves, catches your glance and smirks. "Careful, friend," he says, slicing through a seeded loaf. "You get too close to that queue and you'll lose an eye." He jerks his head toward the women standing in line for bread, most with hats, bonnets, or braids tucked and pinned within an inch of their lives. One sharp turn and wham, right in the cheekbone. He laughs, but it's the kind of laugh that carries a little truth. You step back outside just in time to witness a near miss. An older woman, elegant and upright, leans to inspect a fruit cart and nearly skewers the poor vendor who's crouched behind it. He ducks just in time. She doesn't even notice. The vendor mutters something into his apron, rubs his temple, and gets back to arranging oranges. The unspoken rule in London by 1860 was this: mind the pins. One popular pamphlet of the time, written under the pseudonym, A Victim of Fashion, described the city's hairpin threat in truly Shakespearean tones. They glint in the fog like daggers of the dandies. It warned. They pierce the veil of civility and prick the bubble of decorum. And still, women wore them. Of course they did. Hairpins weren't just tools, they were part of daily identity. To wear your hair down in public was, for most Victorian women, a scandal. It signaled disorder, rebellion, or worse, romantic availability. So pins stayed in, and the panic followed. One police report from 1859 catalogued a curious string of crimes in which hairpins were the key clues. In one case, a man was apprehended trying to pick a lock using what he thought was a standard piece of wire, only for the constable to recognize it immediately as a decorative hairpin, complete with a little glass pearl still attached. Another thief used pins to short-circuit a gas lamp fuse, hoping to rob the shop under cover of darkness. He lit his coat on fire instead. There were even cases of hairpin smuggling. On more than one occasion, customs officers at the docks intercepted shipments of pins disguised as piano wire or fencing equipment. Some were legal knockoffs made to undercut British manufacturers. Others were embellished with tiny gems and smuggled in from France, considered too decadent for local markets. And yet, despite the rising confusion and faint hysteria, no one really knew what to do about it. This was the era when new technologies terrified the public almost as much as they thrilled it. Trains moved faster than horses. Telegraph wires sent invisible messages. Electricity was a whisper, not yet a roar. And somewhere in the middle of all that change sat the humble hairpin, unmoving. Small, yet capable of poking a hole through both skin and status quo. Historians still argue whether the hairpin panic was truly about safety, or whether it masked deeper societal anxieties. Women had begun moving through public space in greater numbers, taking jobs, attending lectures, organizing. Maybe the fear wasn't about a poke in the arm. Maybe it was about power. You stop at a busy intersection as a group of women pass in matching navy skirts and gray shawls. They're teachers, judging by the books and rolled-up charts under their arms. One glances your way. Her eyes flick up, just for a second, and you realize she's checking if you noticed her hairpins. There are 4. Sleek, matte, no shine. The professional's choice. You smile faintly and step aside. A small boy runs past you then, chasing a hoop. His laughter echoes off the bricks as he disappears around the corner. His mother follows at a slower pace, muttering about torn socks and broken teeth. You catch a bit of her sentence, and that girl nearly took his ear off with her blasted hair, before she's swallowed up by the crowd. Meanwhile, in wealthier corners of the city, hairpins had become something of a game. Society columns described them not just as tools but as conversation starters and implements of strategic flirtation. One noblewoman boasted of owning a set of gold-plated pins tipped with tiny emeralds, which she wore only at political dinners. Another, Lady D. of Surrey, had a pin engraved with the motto "Touch not the bun." You turn onto a quieter side street and pass an open window where two maids are chatting as they scrub a stair rail. One says something in a hushed tone, and the other laughs so hard she nearly drops her bucket. A second later, she pulls something from her apron, a hairpin, long and slightly bent, and pantomimes stabbing a rat with it. You're not sure whether it's a joke or a memory. And the city rolls on. Beneath the clatter of hooves and the smoke of coal fires, beneath the sermons and sewing and supper bells, the hairpin remained, silent, slim, and ever so slightly dangerous. Because for all the fear and fuss, no one could deny its usefulness. No one could prove it wasn't secretly revolutionary. And no one, certainly, could predict the strange legal cases it would spark next. You meander now toward Holborn, where the streets grow a bit more chaotic and the air smells faintly of ink and boiled cabbage. A cabman shouts something unintelligible at a pair of loafers blocking the curb. A bell rings, somewhere nearby. A boot scrapes along a stoop as a solicitor's clerk unlocks his office door. It's just another day in London, but if you squint a little, you might notice how the ordinary sometimes rubs shoulders with the absurd. Like the case of Miss Lillian Hartright in the opera incident. It was the talk of the town for weeks, mostly because it had all the ingredients for scandal: high society, injury, an outraged fiancé, and of course, a hairpin. Miss Hartright, seated in the front row of Her Majesty's Theatre, turned her head rather dramatically during an aria, and promptly embedded her hatpin, a longer cousin of the hairpin, into the shoulder of the gentleman seated behind her. His gasp was audible over the orchestra. He did not return to his seat. A doctor was summoned. So was the constable. The newspapers had a field day. But here's the twist. The gentleman in question was her fiancé. And the injury, mild as it was, prompted a full week of public argument. He accused her of violence. She accused him of crowding. Their courtship ended. A minor wedding scandal followed. The hatpin was placed in a museum case at the theater for a few months. Labeled, Cupid's Casualty. You chuckle under your breath. Because this is Victorian London. And of course such a thing happened. It fits. The city is one long costume drama. Just slightly askew. Around this time, the fear of hairpins began to mix with something else. An unshakable belief that they were part of a larger decline in civility. There were sermons. There were letters. One moralist, writing under the name, A London Father, claimed that the hairpin craze was a symptom of the greater female insolence afflicting the empire. This, of course, was nonsense, but that didn't stop people from believing it. Historians still debate whether this strain of commentary was rooted in misogyny, urban anxiety, or simply boredom. Some argue it was a reaction to changing gender roles, women working outside the home, riding unchaperoned, even speaking in public forums. Others claim it was a Victorian version of a moral panic, where fear latched onto the most visible thing. In this case, a bit of bent steel holding up a chignon. Whatever the cause, the hairpin entered the courtroom. A barrister named Edmund Skeet once brought a civil case against a laundress who allegedly scratched his face with her hairpin after a dispute over starching. The case was dismissed, largely because the judge couldn't stop laughing during testimony. "I do not believe she meant to jab you, Mr. Skeet," he said, "but I do sympathize with your surprise." The courtroom reportedly erupted with laughter. The laundress left triumphant. She also sold her story to the Illustrated London News. But not all cases were so trivial. One woman, Sarah Ellicott, stood trial in 1861 for what was ominously described as attempted puncture with intent to insult. The charge stemmed from a confrontation on a tram, in which she allegedly jabbed a man in the arm with a decorative pin. He accused her of malice. She claimed self-defense. He had tried to brush against her skirt. The magistrate sided with Sarah. "The pin may be pointed, Madam," he said, "but so is the law. Let us not tangle the two." Newspapers, of course, gobbled it up. "Woman wields weapon with wry wit," screamed one headline. "No rest for the pin pricked," offered another. The story was dramatized in 2 stage plays within the year. And somewhere in the fog of it all, the Victorian public began to see the hairpin less as a threat and more as a sort of social barometer, one that registered every bump, jostle, and breach of decorum. You pause now before the iron fence outside a grammar school. A line of children marches out 2 by 2. Most boys wearing caps. Most girls with hair neatly pinned beneath ribbons. One girl turns to another and mutters something. There's a giggle. Then a boy yelps and grabs his ear. The girls look innocently ahead, but the twitch of a smile gives them away. The teacher doesn't scold. She just sighs. She's seen it before. There were whispers, too, of hairpins used in more organized forms of defiance. A group of young shopgirls in Whitechapel supposedly carried matching pins engraved with tiny marks, part symbol, part sisterhood. Another tale, likely apocryphal, spoke of a governess who refused to teach until her pins were returned, confiscated by a headmaster who deemed them disruptive and improper. You duck into a covered arcade to avoid a sudden spatter of rain. Candles flicker in a tobacconist's stall. A bookseller props open the door with a stack of forgotten romances. And beside him, a basket labeled, "Penny Pins, no questions asked." You smile. That kind of honesty is rare these days. Because if there's one thing you've learned so far, it's this: no one ever really wanted to ban the hairpin. They just wanted someone else to be responsible for it. And now the city waits, warily, for whatever ridiculous trouble this tiny object will stir up next. The rain lets up as you leave the arcade. Though the clouds still linger overhead like a damp curtain, the streets glisten with puddles, and every passing carriage sends a spray onto unsuspecting boots. You lift your coat collar and press forward, past a newsstand where a freshly inked headline reads, "Hairpin Assault at Paddington Station." You sigh. Another day. Another pin-related panic. This one involves a scuffle between two women arguing over a lost luggage tag. Tempers flared. Accusations flew. One woman allegedly reached up, yanked a pin from her hair, and brandished it like a saber. The other ducked, screamed, and leapt behind a porter. No injuries reported, though the train departed 5 minutes late, and someone's hat was never recovered. It would almost be funny if it weren't so common. By the 1860s, stories like this weren't rare, they were routine. And as you stroll along the wet edge of Hyde Park, your boots brushing fallen chestnut husks, you can't help but wonder, how did this all get so sharp? The answer lies partly in design. Early Victorian hairpins were plain, curved wires, flexible, soft, unlikely to do much damage unless forcefully applied. But as fashion evolved, so did the tools. Hairstyles became more elaborate, requiring longer, sturdier pins. Manufacturers obliged. By 1863, it was possible to buy hairpins over 6 inches long, made of tempered steel, with delicately etched tips or ornamental heads shaped like flowers, daggers, or even tiny snakes. Some were beautiful, some were dangerous, some, arguably, were both. One French style, imported from France and briefly all the rage in Mayfair, featured pins that doubled as scent dispensers. A twist of the head released a puff of rosewater or lavender. But they were also hollow, and when cracked open, could hide notes, powders, even money. Whether these accessories were used for espionage or just particularly dramatic love letters remains unclear. Historians still argue whether these perfume pins were tools of romance or rebellion. You pass a woman seated on a bench beneath a willow tree. She's feeding crumbs to pigeons. Her bonnet tilted slightly askew. As she moves, you notice her hair isn't pinned at all, just braided and tucked into a loose coil. Either she's from the countryside or she's making a quiet statement. Maybe both. Londoners began to divide themselves in subtle ways: pinned versus unpinned, elaborate versus practical, dangerous versus demure. One etiquette guide even classified women by the number of pins they used. Fewer than 5? A modest soul. Between 6 and 10? Ambitious but refined. More than 10? Untrustworthy in matters both romantic and financial. It's unclear whether the author was serious, but society seemed to believe it. In response, some women embraced the absurd. One salon owner in Soho began offering pinless styles, using combs, thread, and gum arabic. Another promoted invisible armor, updos, twisting the hair to hide the pins entirely. The idea was safety, or stealth, or possibly just trendiness. And then came the copycats. Men, naturally, wanted in. Some dandies began wearing imitation hairpins as cravat holders. A few carried pins in their breast pockets, for emergencies. Though what constituted an emergency was rarely specified. In one infamous case, a gentleman used a hairpin to stir his brandy after dropping his spoon. He was not invited back. But some took it further. You stop beside a lamppost plastered with adverts, quack remedies, boarding room vacancies, a violin tutor seeking students, and one curious flyer that reads, "Men against pins. Join the movement for cleaner collars and safer streets." It's been half-torn, rain-streaked, barely legible. Still, it speaks to a sentiment gaining traction, that the hairpin panic was no longer just about accidents. It had become symbolic. To some men, pins represented unruly femininity, women stepping into public space, moving confidently, sometimes even aggressively. And that made people nervous. There were reports of self-appointed safety patrols, usually composed of pompous young clerks, who roamed public gardens warning women about excessive steel. One was hit with a parasol. Another, ironically, tripped over a dislodged hairpin and fractured his thumb. Women, for their part, were not amused. The suffragist movement was gaining ground by the mid-1860s. And though hairpins weren't part of the official platform, they often played an unofficial role. Protesters wore them like badges. Marchers twisted them into banners. And during one particularly rowdy debate in Lambeth, a hairpin was thrown, not at anyone, just into the air, where it arced gracefully and landed in a pot of tea. The crowd roared. You take a turn down a quieter street, where gaslights begin to flicker on against the early twilight. The haze rolls in again, soft and golden, curling around lampposts and soot-darkened bricks. Somewhere in the distance, church bells toll the hour. A woman passes you, young, brisk, eyes forward. Her hat is modest, but as she strides past, you catch the faint shimmer of a dozen silver pins holding it in place. There's a confidence to her step, an intention. And you realize something. The hairpin panic may have started as a safety concern, but it had grown into something stranger, something stitched into the fabric of Victorian life. A tension between control and independence, between fashion and fear, between what a woman could wear and what she could do with it. And like the pins themselves, that tension was hard to ignore. By now the streetlights flicker steadily, haloed by fog and dust as night leans gently over London. Your footsteps are slower, muffled by damp pavement. The city has quieted, but it hasn't relaxed. You can feel it in the glances exchanged at street corners, in the half-laughed whispers between bundled-up pedestrians, The air is heavy not just with coal smoke and mist, but with expectation that something, anything, might once again be blamed on a hairpin. You cut through a narrow lane and find yourself in front of a poster-covered wall. Among the usual theater listings and miracle cures is a handbill in bold, smeared type. Beware the lady with the long hair, anonymous tales of spies, stabbings and suspicion. It's probably fiction, but in 1864, that didn't stop anyone from believing it. Because this was the era when hairpins weren't just fashion accessories, they were plot devices. Take, for instance, the rumors swirling around the tunnels of London's newest rail lines. In the midst of soot, steam, and industrial marvels, a bizarre whisper began to circulate that spies, female spies, were using hairpins to sabotage tracks, short-circuit lantern systems, and even unlock private carriages. One conductor claimed to have discovered pin fragments near a derailed cart. Another reported seeing a woman flick a pin across a signaling panel, as though casting a spell. Of course, none of these stories could be verified, and historians still argue whether they were born from truth, paranoia, or the giddy thrill of a city inventing its own myths. What is certain is that hairpins began appearing in strange places. One cleaning woman found a dozen lodged behind the bricks of a telegraph office, perhaps fallen from a coat. Perhaps not. A bookseller discovered 2 in the spine of a leather-bound novel. A brewer swore he pulled one from a cask, though it's unclear how it got there or what it was doing next to the hops. In a city this crowded, secrets stuck to everything. You pass a brick building with tall, arched windows, the remnants of a post office sorting center. In its heyday, it processed tens of thousands of letters a day. One clerk, known as Sharp Eye Silas, reportedly collected a box of items pulled from mailbags, unclaimed trinkets, stray jewelry, and yes, hairpins. One in particular became famous, a twisted, rust-stained pin with a loop at the end, said to have been used to seal secret letters shut with wax. Like a signet, Silas said, though nobody ever proved it. There was even talk of a secret society, les Dames de Fer, the Ladies of Steel, likely fictional. Their supposed mission was to disrupt male institutions using the quiet tools of femininity. Hairpins featured prominently, along with mirrored compacts and sharpened knitting needles. Some said they met in a tea room in Soho. Others insisted they used the pins to communicate, leaving coded patterns in their hair for each meeting. Were they real? Probably not. But did people act like they might be? Absolutely. You cross a stone bridge now, the Thames glinting black beneath you. The river is quiet tonight, no barges, no calls, just the echo of your steps and the occasional squawk of a gull. To your left, In the shadow of the bridge's arch, someone has scrawled a message in chalk. Her pin held more than her hair. Poetic, possibly true. Even outside of espionage lore, the hairpin had acquired a reputation for mischief. A brief flurry of fiction emerged in the 1860s, penny novels, newspaper serials, even one operetta titled The Prick of Fate. All of them featured heroines whose hairpins were pivotal. In one, the heroine uses her pin to escape a locked carriage. In another, it becomes a murder weapon, though off-page, of course, to preserve decency. And in the real world? Judges began requesting that female witnesses remove their pins before taking the stand, not because of security risks, but to eliminate distractions. One courtroom clerk famously kept a cigar box full of surrendered pins. "No duplicates," he said, "but plenty of stories." Meanwhile, schools grew cautious. A few boarding academies banned certain pin styles outright, anything with colored glass or sharp tips. One headmistress in Devon insisted on rounded bracing tools, and warned that anything more aggressive would be considered an act of rebellion. That warning, naturally, sparked several small rebellions. You stroll now through a narrow back alley that feeds into a quieter square. Oil lamps flicker against the soot-stained walls. And behind lace curtains, silhouettes move through their evening routines. A girl at a writing desk adjusts her braid. A woman removes a row of pins and lays them carefully on a porcelain tray. The steel glints for a moment, cold, perfect, unassuming. Historians still puzzle over the scale of the panic. Was it ever really about the pins? Or was it about control? Who had it? Who lost it? And who suddenly had just enough to make people nervous? Because no law was ever passed. No bans were issued. Yet the fear lingered. For years. Even now, as the city hushes toward midnight, you imagine what it must have felt like to walk these streets with a dozen needles twisted into your hair, each one a silent declaration. A functional weapon, or maybe just the thing that kept your curls from collapsing into chaos. And maybe that's the real heart of it. The hairpin didn't cause the chaos. It just held it in place. You make your way into Covent Garden now, where the last of the market stalls are being packed away under flickering lamplight. Apples tumble into crates, stray bits of straw swirl around your boots, and a stray cat darts between shadows, chasing something invisible. You pass a vendor folding up canvas awnings and muttering under his breath about them blasted pins again. You don't ask for details. You already know it's something mildly ridiculous and wholly believable. Because by this point in the Victorian hairpin saga, the panic had spread far beyond fashion or fear. It had entered the trades. Barbers were some of the loudest complainers. In their defense, they had a point. Hairpins clogged shears. dented razors, and occasionally drew blood from distracted hands. One particularly dramatic barber wrote a letter to the Penny Post claiming he had suffered puncture upon puncture, like Saint Sebastian, by the stealthy steel of unremoved lady wear. The letter was printed in full and caused a week-long stir in the tonsorial community. A few shops even posted signs, "Please remove pins before entering." Other tradesmen weren't immune. Milliners complained of bent hat brims. Tailors lamented torn linings where pins had slipped through seams. Even bakers grumbled that pins were turning up in aprons and flour sacks, though it's unclear how or why those ended up there. Historians still argue whether these grievances were widespread or simply a fashionable excuse for workplace grumbling. The paranoia extended to businesses, too. One insurance company reportedly considered charging higher premiums for shops catering exclusively to high-pinned clientele, fearing claims related to accidental injury or public nuisance. It never happened, but again, the fact that it was discussed tells you something about the absurd height of the panic. And then there were the bizarre lawsuits. You turn a corner and pass the broad stone steps of a magistrate's court. Its doors now closed and its halls dark, but its history alive with stories of squabbles that landed before the bench. There was the infamous Baker versus Worthington case, where a woman accused her grocer of shoving her cart and causing her hairpin to stab her own scalp. The court was patient, the jurors less so. In the end, she received a mild apology and a voucher for apples. But the most theatrical courtroom moment came with the Crown versus Amelia Fern. A trial that gripped London like a Dickens novel. Amelia, a seamstress, had allegedly brandished her hairpin during a heated argument with her landlady about unpaid rent. The landlady claimed assault. Amelia claimed she had only been adjusting her bun, and the landlady had stepped into her gesture. The case was so ambiguous it made the front page. Witnesses were divided. One described Amelia's movement as flourishing, but not violent. Another swore she'd seen a gleam of intention in her eyes. The judge, clearly exhausted by the proceedings, simply ruled, "The pin is not the problem. The problem is proximity, and perhaps temper." The gallery applauded. You pass a street lamp with a wrought iron base, rusted and pocked with old chalk marks. Someone has scrawled a new one. Sharp minds, sharper pins. The motto fits. By now, even satire couldn't keep up. The Punch magazine produced a cartoon of Queen Victoria herself wielding a giant hatpin like a fencing foil. In another, a troop of ladies armed with pins marched across Westminster Bridge under a banner that read, "Steel and Suffrage." Of course, Her Majesty never commented on the cartoons. But the fact that they existed was a sign of the times. And it wasn't only London. Other cities caught the bug. Liverpool newspapers ran hairpin stories with increasing frequency. One reported a Pin duel between two women at a textile fair. Manchester had its own hairpin watch committee, reportedly formed by concerned husbands and entirely ignored by their wives. Even smaller towns, far from London's fog and noise, found themselves tangled in the drama. A postmaster in York supposedly banned hairpins from his office, claiming they interfered with the sorting machine. Experts said that was unlikely. Still, the story stuck. You pass a cafe now. Shutters drawn, tables stacked inside. Through the glass, you glimpse a copy of the Illustrated London News folded open to a feature about fashion's little forks, a 12-paragraph essay equal parts admiration and alarm. It describes the pin as a paradox in steel, ornamental, lethal, essential, and maddening. No one could agree on whether it was progress or peril. One reverend even gave a sermon titled, "The Hidden Point of Vanity," drawing a metaphor between outward beauty and inward sin, each propped up, he claimed, by a tiny instrument of deceit. His congregation applauded politely, then left the chapel with their buns perfectly intact. Not long after, a merchant on Charing Cross began selling novelty safety pins made of soft copper. They bent easily, broke under strain, and weren't much use, but they were popular among those too polite, or too paranoid, for steel. It didn't matter that they didn't work. It mattered that they seemed safer. And perhaps that was the whole point. People weren't responding to pins. They were responding to unease. To a world shifting beneath their feet. To women moving freely, dressing boldly, and refusing to be ignored. You stop now at the edge of a quiet garden square. Gaslight flickers across iron fencing. And somewhere nearby, a piano plays a drifting, slightly out of tune waltz. The sound curls into the fog like steam. You wonder, how many pins are in this square alone? In the hats of late-night strollers? In the gloves of servants returning home? In the floorboards of carriages, forgotten by passengers who were too busy, too tired, or too caught in thought to notice what had slipped free? The city holds them all. Silent, tiny, waiting. The garden square feels still, like the city is holding its breath. You move along the fence, boots muffled by fallen leaves, and find yourself imagining what it must have been like to live in a time when something as minor as a hair accessory could spark legal drama, trigger sermons, inspire novels, and quietly threaten the status quo, all without anyone agreeing on whether it was even worth worrying about. Which brings us to the courtrooms of London, the true theatre of the Victorian hairpin panic. If there was ever a moment when the absurd met the official, it was here. The Victorian legal system, steeped in decorum and desperate to maintain public order, found itself repeatedly tangled, sometimes literally, in disputes over hairpins. Some were genuine injuries. A woman entering a bakery jostled a man as she turned. and her pin left a small gouge on his forehead. He fainted. A doctor applied brandy and gauze. A lawsuit followed. The woman claimed she had merely secured her curls in haste. The man claimed permanent dizziness. The magistrate dismissed it as an unfortunate collision of vanity and impatience. But many other cases were not about harm. They were about intent. Like the case of the governess who allegedly menaced a footman with her coiffure. The footman had refused to fetch her trunk from the attic, and during the ensuing argument, she adjusted her hair with excessive vigor. No physical contact occurred, but he filed a complaint citing psychological distress and threat of bodily injury. The judge ruled that the adjustment of one's hairstyle, no matter how aggressively done, did not qualify as intimidation. That ruling did not stop the next wave of claims. A string of lawsuits began appearing that year, often brought by men who accused women of pin proximity assaults. One claimed that a hairpin had pierced his coat lapel during a tight squeeze on the omnibus. Another insisted a woman had aimed her pins toward him during a disagreement in a bookshop. Yet another alleged a woman used her pins to communicate rude gestures by arranging them at provocative angles. Historians still debate whether these claims were a coordinated reactionary movement or simply the product of widespread unease. Either way, the courts found themselves handling case after case where judges, barristers, and jurors, all male, of course, were forced to interpret the social physics of hatpins and head tilts. You turn a corner now and pass the flickering lamps outside a barrister's chamber. One window still glows with candlelight. Inside, a young man in robes stares at a stack of papers. Scratching his head, perhaps preparing arguments about whether an updo constitutes a weapon in public space. You wonder if he's working on the infamous Latham versus Thistlewick case. Ah yes, Latham versus Thistlewick. It involved a widow, a dog, and a poorly timed sneeze. Mrs. Latham, standing in line at a post office, had just secured her bonnet when Thistlewick's Pomeranian barked behind her. She startled, turned, and inadvertently stuck the man behind her in the cheek with a sharp silver pin. The injury was slight, but the spectacle was great. Witnesses described a perfect eruption of umbrellas, followed by a small stampede toward the post office doors. Mr. Thistlewick, clutching his face and dramatically quoting scripture, demanded compensation. Mrs. Latham maintained it was his accursed rat dog that caused the mishap. The trial was brief. The judge declared, "If we are to litigate every act of accidental elegance, we shall be here until the empire falls." The case was dismissed. Mrs. Latham was given a handkerchief. Mr. Thistlewick was advised to keep his Pomeranian leashed. Not all courtroom tales ended so peaceably. You walk now toward a broader avenue where the gas lamps burn brighter. Across the street is an old alehouse. The Cracked Tooth. where lawyers are said to have once held informal debates over ale and oysters. One tale claims a particularly irritable judge, known for his intolerance of anything he deemed frivolous, kept a hairpin on his bench as a visual warning to litigants. When asked about it, he reportedly replied, "If I must suffer another pin dispute, I shall use this one myself. You may interpret that as you like." There were also cases that bordered on the poetic. One defendant claimed her hairpin was a monument to heartbreak, worn only during times of emotional turbulence. Another referred to hers as a symbol of restraint in a world too free with its hands. A particularly eloquent tailor claimed he was stabbed not by a pin, but by a passing sorrow masquerading as fashion. These cases, while rarely successful, revealed a deeper truth. Hairpins had become symbols of identity, of resistance, of space. Because the courtroom wasn't just a place for deciding fault, it was where society played out its anxieties in public. Where the image of a woman simply adjusting her hair could be interpreted, under the right circumstances, as threat, rebellion, or flirtation. You pass a bench where two men in top hats argue over the Pall Mall Gazette. One insists that hatpins should be licensed. The other shrugs, saying if women wanted to walk around with blades in their heads, that was their business. Neither notices that their wives, seated beside them, are already rolling their eyes. And across the square, in a dressmaker's window, a tiny sign reads, "No refunds on pins. They know what they did." The humor is sharp, but behind it is a kind of weary wisdom. The city had spent years chasing these little bits of metal through courtrooms and carriage aisles, alleyways and editorial pages, and still, no one had found a proper answer. Because it wasn't about solving anything. It was about trying to pin down something that refused to stay still. Just like the hair itself. The square grows quieter now. As the hour deepens and the gas lamps hum, you move again, feet softer on the flagstones, tracing a path that leads you through narrow passages between buildings. A street sweeper tips his cap as you pass. Somewhere, a pub bell rings its last. And all around you, London exhales, tired, damp, and still bristling faintly with pins. The panic, you begin to realize, wasn't just about fashion or injury. It was about the body. Specifically, the female body, its presence, its movement, its unexpected defiance of the spaces it was told to occupy. And nowhere did this tension manifest more strangely than in the world of medicine. You duck beneath a soot-black awning into a quieter street where the windows are dark and the names on brass plaques read like a roll call of physicians. Thistlethwaite and Sons. Surgeons General. Dr. Pembroke, fevers and choleric fits, and of course, Miss Annabel Thatch, midwife and ladies' consultant. You pause in front of one in particular. a private consulting house once famous for its work with female ailments. In 1865, this clinic submitted a now famous series of papers to the Royal Society, linking hairpins, yes, hairpins, to a rash of new illnesses among women. The diagnosis? Cranial pin fatigue. It was a phrase coined by Dr. Bertrand Moseley, a well-meaning but spectacularly dramatic man. His theory was simple, that the constant weight, pressure, and shifting of heavy hairstyles secured by metal pins could lead to a delirium of the nerves, triggering dizziness, headaches, and even hallucinations. He warned that women were walking about like ticking clocks, each pin a gear out of place. Was there any truth to it? Historians still argue. Some modern analysts suggest his theory was based on misdiagnosed migraines. Others believe he simply misunderstood what stress and poor nutrition looked like. But his ideas took hold, not because they were accurate, but because they were useful. Soon, any woman who fainted in public or lost her balance while dismounting from a carriage might be asked, "Are you wearing too many pins today, dear?" One article in the British Medical Journal reported a case where a woman entered a fugue state after her chignon collapsed on a tram. Another told of a schoolmistress who, after reprimanding a particularly unruly student, fell to the floor, clutching her hair and muttering about pressure. Diagnosis: pin fatigue. Prescription: rest and lighter hairpins. A few doctors got creative. One patented the Moseley comb, a lightweight alternative made from carved horn that could be used in place of pins. Another designed breathing bonnets, which looked more like colanders than hats, under the belief that airflow would cure scalp congestion. Neither invention caught on. But the fear lingered. Some households forbade daughters from using more than 5 pins at once. Others banned steel entirely. A popular women's magazine ran a column on how to achieve elegant hair without the metal. Its tone was gentle, but its message was clear. If you're feeling faint or melancholy, look to your head first. You pass a narrow alley where an old iron sign swings in the breeze. Cure thyself naturally. Dr. Whitlow's Oils and Combs. Another relic of the age, part doctor, part snake oil salesman, Whitlow claimed to cure pin madness with lavender compresses and gentle brushwork. He also sold pamphlets warning that the human scalp was not meant to bear arms. And that's where the language starts to shift. Because in medical papers, courtrooms, and conversations, pins began to be described not as adornments, but as weapons. Not by accident, not metaphorically, but literally. Women who refused to remove their pins in male-dominated spaces were labeled combative. One railway station posted a sign asking women to disarm before boarding, meaning, of course, to unpin their hats. It was phrased with a wink, but the effect was clear. Pins became a quiet form of protest. Some suffragist circles adopted them deliberately. One group in Chelsea even designed a uniform hairstyle. A braided coil fastened with 4 visible pins and 1 hidden. The hidden one was symbolic. Let them wonder where it is. Their leaflet read, "Let them wonder what we might do with it." You reach the edge of a hospital building. Its wrought iron gate locked for the night. Beyond it lies the city's memory, records, archives, cases, stories of women who fainted, stumbled, protested, or simply tried to keep their hair from falling apart. There's something touching about it all. The idea that amidst the clamor of empire and industry, someone paused to worry about a pin, a bit of wire, a slip of steel, and somehow, it carried all the weight of revolution. You glance at a woman passing by now. Head uncovered, hair loose and unbound, a rarity. Her eyes meet yours, and she lifts a brow slightly, as if to say, "What are you staring at?" Then she's gone, vanishing into the mist like a punctuation mark without a sentence. And you're left standing there, wondering just how many times a pin has held more than hair, has carried meaning. Defiance, memory, protection, or simply the desperate hope that something might stay in place, if only for a while. You walk now along Marylebone Lane, where the shops are shuttered and the lanterns flicker low. The city is quieter here, less coal smoke, more chimney scent, more of that damp brick still warm from the day's fading heat. The further you go, the more you feel the city shift beneath your feet, not in geography, but in tone, like it's trying to forget the panic it helped stir, or at least pretend it never happened. But schools remember. If courtrooms made hairpins notorious, and physicians tried to pathologize them, then classrooms were where the real absurdities played out, and you can't help but smile as you recall the odd, documented incidents that unfolded beneath chalkboards and behind inkwells. Take the curious case of Miss Wenderley's apple. A schoolmistress of strict temperament and towering stature, Miss Wenderley ran a girls' school in South Kensington. One October morning in 1866, she discovered a sharpened hairpin impaled in the center of an apple on her desk. It wasn't a threat, at least not directly. More like an artistic protest. The apple had a face drawn on it, the pin like a sword through its skull. Beneath it was a slip of paper, "Long live free hair." The scandal was immediate. Parents were notified. Students were interrogated. The offending apple was preserved in the school archive for nearly 20 years. No one ever confessed. That same year, the Education Reform Herald published an op-ed titled, "Discipline and the Hairpin: A Growing Dilemma." It warned that girls were using pins not just in hairstyles, but in secret codes, arranged in books, aligned along desk edges, even clinked against tin lunch pails in sequences. One headmaster compared it to semaphore. Another accused girls of smuggling dangerous sentiments in their scalp architecture. Historians still argue whether this was real or just adults mistaking coincidence for conspiracy. But the effect was the same. Teachers began treating pins not just as accessories, but as liabilities. Some schools responded by banning them altogether. At Miss Tillybrooke's Academy for Young Ladies, pins were confiscated at the gate each morning and returned at day's end in small silk pouches. The policy worked, until one rainy afternoon when a student named Eliza Finch used a bootlace and 2 ink-dipped pins to sabotage the classroom globe. No one was injured, but Brazil was permanently reclassified as Smudgeland. Other schools issued their own pins, blunt-tipped, marked with initials, rationed like chalk. They came to be known as parlor pins, and were generally considered humiliating. Students retaliated by smuggling sharpened extras in boot heels or bonnet linings. One girl at St. Cecily's School wrote an anonymous poem comparing the headmistress to a hedgehog, without the charm. It was pinned to the main door. Of course, not all pin drama was so subversive. Sometimes it was just practical. You stroll past a former school building now. Its windows boarded up, ivy curling around the ironwork. A plaque on the gate reads, "Founded 1842. But the real stories lie inside. Like the time a student used her pin to carve Latin verbs into her desk. Or the incident where 3 girls used pins to rewire a classroom bell, setting it off every time someone leaned back in a chair." Even the boys' schools weren't immune. Though they didn't wear pins themselves, they became oddly fascinated by them. In one case, a group of schoolboys collected discarded pins from nearby streets and attempted to build a hairpin trebuchet. It flung a current bun nearly 15 feet before collapsing in a tangle of ribbon and nails. You turn down a side lane now, where the buildings give way to narrower homes and smaller windows, governess territory. Behind one curtain, a lamp still glows. You imagine a woman inside, quietly pinning up her hair for the night. Perhaps with fewer pins than usual. Perhaps not. Maybe she remembers the time her pupil used one to pick the lock on the library cabinet. Or maybe she's thinking about how every lesson in posture, etiquette, and Latin had to compete with what the girls already knew. That the pins in their hair could do more than tidy curls. And there's a strange kind of comfort in that. Not defiance. Exactly. Just quiet capability. The city may not have liked the implications of the pin, but it couldn't stop them from being used. Teachers adjusted. Girls grew clever. And the panic, while never officially resolved, began to shift from active fear to tired resignation. A final spark came with the 1869 gown and hatpin incident at Westbridge School, in which a student, name redacted from reports, used her pins to form an actual protest slogan stitched into the hem of her graduation robe. It read, "We are not accessories." She was suspended, but later reinstated, and later still, invited back as a guest speaker. It wasn't the end of the panic. But it was the beginning of the city starting to laugh at itself. From schools and salons to courts and cathedrals, the hairpin had made its mark, sometimes literally, on nearly every corner of Victorian society. But the question that remained, the one whispered over teacups and muttered on train platforms, was this: would anything actually be done about it? That brings us to one of the more quietly comedic chapters in this saga. The almost happened but didn't Great Hairpin recall. You find yourself near Westminster now. The stone facades of government buildings looming in the fog. Gas lamps catch on gilded railings. A constable yawns near a stoop. Somewhere nearby, a parliamentary clerk is still awake, drafting correspondence by candlelight. But in 1867, this district was abuzz with something utterly unexpected: a private member's bill on hairpin regulation. It began innocently. A junior MP from Norwich, Charles Brantley, known mostly for opposing noise in libraries, stood up during an otherwise dull session and proposed a measure. Not a ban, not censorship, just guidance, something to ensure the responsible and safe use of domestic fastening implements in shared public spaces. That's how he phrased it. The chamber blinked. Then someone laughed. Then someone didn't. Within a week, the newspapers had seized on the proposal. "Is this the end of the pin?" asked the Illustrated Review. The Morning Times called it a solution in search of a scandal. Satirical sketches appeared overnight. Women having their hats searched by customs officers. Men wearing iron bibs. Children weeping over confiscated barrettes. Historians still argue whether Brantley's proposal was serious or simply a poorly delivered joke. But the fallout was very real. A special committee was formed, the Advisory Council on Personal Ornaments and Domestic Fasteners. It was composed of 9 men, 2 women, progressive for the time, and 1 extremely tired typist. Their task? To evaluate whether hairpins posed a statistically verifiable threat to public well-being. They examined medical reports, police records, and dozens of witness accounts. They even visited a hat shop in Soho, where one committee member was poked in the hand while handling a bonnet. "Field research," he muttered grimly, dabbing his palm. The findings were inconclusive. Some argued that pin-related injuries had spiked in correlation with wider hats and denser crowds. Others pointed out that hairpins had been around for centuries without such fuss. And one woman on the committee, Lady Morley, famously declared, "If gentlemen are so delicate as to be felled by a hatpin, perhaps they should avoid standing so close to ladies." You turn now onto a quieter street near the Thames. The committee once met in one of these buildings, a handsome brownstone with ivy curling across its 2nd floor. A forgotten landmark. Inside, they debated everything from pin length, 4 inches or less was suggested, to curvature, tip design, and even potential storage solutions. One member proposed pin sleeves made of wool. Another suggested women should be issued a monthly ration, 10 pins. Marked and registered. The room fell silent. That idea was never brought up again. Outside Parliament, the idea of a recall gained traction, not from lawmakers, but from entrepreneurs. A pamphlet campaign sponsored by a corset company began circulating. Fewer pins, better posture. It claimed that reducing head weight would alleviate back strain. Their solution? Hairnets, combs, elegant alternatives to chaos. One poster showed a woman dropping pins into a bucket labeled past mistakes. It was theatrical, and it didn't work. Fashion, it turned out, was not easily legislated. You stop beside a statue in a quiet square. Some forgotten reformer gesturing heroically toward traffic. A few crows perch on his outstretched arm. Just behind him is an old shop, once known for selling regrettable haberdashery. The shopkeeper famously advertised pins without a past, meant to reassure anxious customers they hadn't been used in scandal or accident. They came in sealed paper envelopes with vague names like Serenity and Resolve. They didn't sell well. The public, despite the noise, wasn't interested in throwing away its pins. The panic, by now, had lost its bite. There were fewer lawsuits. The editorials were less shrill. Even the police stopped filing pin-related injuries under assault and started calling them incidental contact. A quiet demotion. And eventually, the council concluded its work. No recommendations were made. No law was passed. A final report was filed, buried somewhere in the records of 1868 under the title Findings on the Socio-Cultural Utility and Minor Risks of Female Hair Fastening Implements. The file was never read in session. The committee was quietly dissolved. London carried on. You take a breath now. Standing by the river, the water shifting slow and black under the streetlights. You imagine that report, gathering dust on a shelf somewhere. Still intact, still unread. Its pages filled with graphs of head curvature, diagrams of ideal pin angles, and the solemn conclusion that women's hairpins, dangerous or not, were probably here to stay. Because in the end, the Great Hairpin recall never happened. Not because it wasn't imagined, or debated, or feared, but because no one, not Parliament, not police, not even fashion, could decide how to hold down what was meant to move. You leave the river behind now, following the lamplit curve of the embankment toward the city's heart. London seems to exhale once more, as though the fog itself has grown drowsy. And you, still tracing the forgotten ripples of the hairpin panic, begin to sense its fading shape, less a sharp point now, more a whisper. But just when you think the storm has passed, you come upon an unexpected twist. Because just as the outrage began to settle, men got involved. Yes, they had always been in the background, judging, legislating, tripping over pins on trams, but now they wanted in. Not on the receiving end, mind you, but on the trend. It began innocently, as so many strange things do, with fashion. Dandies of the mid to late 1860s, always keen to keep their collars high and their egos higher, began experimenting with accessory symmetry, meaning, of course, they wanted to balance their top-heavy hats with something decorative lower down. One tailor on Savile Row offered gold-plated hatpins as lapel ornaments, designed specifically to mimic women's hair accessories. They caught on quickly, though no one quite knew why. Soon, gentlemen could purchase imitation pins made of ivory, pearl, or faux steel, which was really just painted wood. Some were purely ornamental. Others were tools, letter openers, pipe tampers, even hidden measuring sticks. One particularly ostentatious version contained a functioning compass. Of course, some men insisted on practicality. A solicitors' club in Bloomsbury promoted its own line of gentlemen's securing rods, meant to hold cravats in place during debates. They were short-lived. The rods bent easily, and one incident involving a heated exchange over soup resulted in a mild puncture and a very stained waistcoat. You pass a small haberdasher now, shutters drawn, but you can still see the window display. A mannequin in full evening dress. A single pin stuck jauntily through his bow tie like a miniature rapier. There's even a tag beneath it, for the confident caller. What had begun as mimicry soon bled into absurdity. Men formed safety societies, claiming that unregulated female hairpins endangered not just social decorum but public masculinity. They wrote leaflets, held meetings. One group in Southwark began issuing certificates to men who'd survived a documented pin encounter. The certificates came with brass buttons and a motto: Vigilans et vulneratis, vigilant and wounded. You can't help but laugh softly. Because of course they did. But not all men responded with irony. Some grew genuinely unnerved. Pickpockets, for example, began complaining in their own way. In court testimonies and street gossip, there were whispers that women had started using their pins to defend their coin. One known thief claimed he'd been repelled by a hidden stain when trying to lift a purse from a woman's coat pocket. Another fled a crowd after a pin pierced his hand through his glove. These incidents gave rise to the urban myth of the safety pin vigilante, a woman who wandered the arcades at dusk. Stabbing would-be pickpockets with surgical precision. No one could prove she existed, but her legend spread quickly, especially in Soho, where she was said to wear a velvet cloak and never speak. Historians still argue whether she was real, a composite, or just a ghost story for dishonest men. But by 1870, The idea of a woman armed with a pin was no longer laughable, it was thrilling, mysterious, and for some, slightly terrifying. You step into a square where a public fountain trickles faintly in the gloom. At its base, scratched into the mossy stone, are 3 small letters, SPV. Likely coincidence, or maybe not. Meanwhile, more respectable gentlemen began rebranding their relationship with pins. Writers used them metaphorically. A poet declared his heartbreak, pinned beneath the weight of her silver crown. A dramatist opened his play with the line, "She entered, sharp as a whisper, veiled in hair and pins." Even political cartoons began showing parliamentarians with bun-like hairdos and captioned insults like, "secured but not stable." And in an even stranger turn, some men started collecting hairpins. You pass a curio shop now. The kind that sells dusty maps, moth-eaten gloves, and opera glasses missing their lenses. Behind its cracked glass, you spot a velvet-lined box labeled "Gentleman's Collection of Miscellaneous Pins, 1860 to 1875. Inside are a dozen slender shapes, twisted, curved, some plain, some barbed. Beneath each is a tiny placard, "Omnibus Incident. Suspected suffragette. Found in custard at Wimpole Street." It's absurd, but also endearing, like the city trying to catalog its embarrassment. Because at some point, the fear gave way to fascination. Men who had once trembled at the thought of a hatpin now admired them from a safe distance. What had started as mockery became curiosity. What was once seen as threat became artifact. Even museums began to take notice. In 1871, the London Museum of Everyday Life opened a small exhibit titled, "Pinned Histories: The Social Life of the Hairpin." It featured vintage combs, recovered pins, scandalous cartoons, and the famous apple from Miss Wenderley's school. Visitors could read excerpts from trial transcripts and see sketches of courtroom dramatics. One placard described the era as a time when fashion, fear, and femininity collided over something barely 5 inches long. You stop now in front of a wrought iron bench. Worn smooth by decades, you sit, just for a moment, and imagine it. A whole world panicking over steel needles hidden in hair. And not because of the danger, but because of what they meant. Movement, autonomy, the soft refusal to be harmless. Because sometimes, the sharpest changes are the quietest. You rise from the bench as the wind picks up. Not cold exactly, but insistent, pushing gently at your coat. Rustling the few dry leaves that cling stubbornly to the gutter edges. London is growing quieter by the minute. Church bells strike softly in the distance. Somewhere, a carriage clatters on its final run for the night. And overhead, the clouds drift low and slow. like breath across glass. By now, the hairpin panic had run its course in most corners of polite society. The courts had tired of it. The press had mined it for all its mischief. And even the poets had moved on to more romantic metaphors. But before it faded entirely, the story had one last absurd crescendo, what many now call the last hairpin riot. It happened not in Parliament, nor a school, nor a street-side scandal, but in the most innocuous of places, a department store. In 1873, the Maison Roussel department store on Regent Street, known for its luxurious fabrics, elaborate hat displays, and subtle air of superiority, unveiled a new, safety fashion, section. The idea, according to the shop's circular, was to promote accessories that were both elegant and unintrusive. This included smaller hatpins, padded corset stays, and featherweight parasols. The marketing was subtle, but the signage was not. Large placards throughout the store read, "Secure gracefully, no need for pointed statements. Refinement, not resistance. Ladies, let us help you disarm." You can imagine what happened next. The opening week saw a steady stream of disapproval disguised as shopping. Women browsed with tight smiles, said nothing, and left with empty hands. But on the fifth day, something snapped, or perhaps clicked. A group of women, led by a quiet but famously sharp-witted piano teacher named Mrs. Trevelyan, entered the store not to shop, but to return every hairpin they'd ever purchased there, in person, one by one. They stood in a neat line, dressed in Sunday best, each woman carrying a small pouch or paper envelope. One by one, they approached the returns counter and placed their pins on the polished mahogany surface. Some said nothing, some smiled sweetly. One recited Byron. It would have ended there. A silent protest, nothing more. But then, a store manager, flustered, pompous, and tragically unaware of tone, called security. He referred to the women as armed agitators. The crowd watching from the glove aisle erupted in protest. Within moments, the perfume counter was overturned, the hat display dismantled, and a mannequin impaled with at least 11 pins. A passing clergyman fainted. A boy took off running with a drawer of cufflinks. A decorative fan caught fire, no one knows how. And through it all, Mrs. Trevelyan stood at the center of the chaos, utterly serene, pin in hand, hair perfectly unmoved. The newspapers called it a riot. In truth, it was more of a glorified mess. No one was seriously injured. The store was closed for 2 days, restocked, and quietly removed all signs referencing disarming. But the cultural impact lingered. The last hairpin riot, as it came to be known, signaled a shift not just in public patience, but in narrative. The idea that something so small, so ordinary, could incite outrage and symbolism, well, it no longer shocked people. It had become a punchline, a parable, something children giggled about in schoolyards and old men muttered about on porches. Even the phrase, "to cause a hairpin stir," entered the language for a brief time, describing any sudden, overblown panic over something mundane. You pass a closed cafe now. Its chalkboard menu still listing hairpin pudding among the day's desserts. It's not a reference to food, just a joke, sweet, old-fashioned, and a little ridiculous, a nod to the past. And what a past it had been. Over 2 decades, the hairpin had evolved from a simple fashion necessity into an accidental flashpoint. It had wandered through courts and classrooms, parliaments and parlors, poems and protests. It had been blamed for bruises, heartbreaks, lawsuits, near duels, political metaphors, and one fairly confused duck, found with a pin through its wing near Hampstead Heath. Foul play was never confirmed. Historians still debate whether the panic was justified, whether the injuries were frequent or simply fashionable to report, whether women actually used hairpins in protest, or whether the world just imagined they might. But the thing that no one questions anymore is this: the hairpin mattered. Not because it injured people, but because it made people uncomfortable with who held it. You round a corner now and find yourself in front of a long-shuttered bookshop. In the dusty window display, a single volume rests between 2 broken candle stubs. Fastened, an intimate history of pins, power, and panic. It's probably long out of print, but the title says enough. Because that was the story all along, how a sliver of steel became a mirror, reflecting back the absurdity of fear, the fragility of status, and the quiet strength of those who simply needed their hair to stay put. You leave the bookshop behind, the faint outline of the book's title still lingering in your mind like the last lines of a bedtime fable, familiar, improbable, and somehow deeply human. The streets now are nearly deserted. The fog thickens again, folding around lamplight and footsteps, wrapping the city in a soft hush, as if even London itself is finally ready to sleep. But before you go, there's one last piece of the story left. Because no object in Victorian England, not even something as mundane as a hairpin, could escape the slow but certain turn of fashion. The age was shifting, hemlines rose, hats grew smaller, hairstyles loosened, and with that, the need for 23 steel pins per morning began to loosen, too. By the 1880s, the towering coiffures that once demanded military-grade scaffolding were falling out of style. Women wore their hair lower, softer, often in a single braided twist or a loose knot. The kind of styles that required 3 pins, maybe 4 if it was windy. Department stores, now wiser, quietly replaced safety fashion signs with gentler slogans like light elegance for modern ladies. The hairpins themselves changed, too. Manufacturers introduced celluloid options, lighter, decorative, less sharp, pearl-tipped pins, rounded ends, pins shaped like vines or ribbons. The language changed. Grip became glide, secure became caress, and the old phrase, armed with pins, faded from editorials and became a grandmother's idiom. Said with a smile. Londoners moved on. The lawsuits slowed to a trickle. The cartoons turned nostalgic. And those who'd lived through the peak of the panic looked back on it like you might look at an old, over-the-top holiday story. Remember when people thought pins were dangerous? Remember the apple on the desk? The courtroom dramas? The riot over signage? And yet, there was something in it that stayed. You stroll through a narrow side street now, one lined with tall brick houses and wrought iron fences. In a second-story window, you spot a flicker of movement, a woman brushing out her hair in silhouette. Her arms slow, methodical, deliberate, the kind of action you've seen 100 times in portraits, in films, in half-remembered stories from generations past. And just before she disappears behind the curtain, you see her reach to the table and pick up something small and glinting. One last pin. Still used, still needed, not as symbol, not as scandal. Just as a tool, a habit, a gesture passed down through time. Historians today speak of the hairpin panic as one of those curious moments where society momentarily spiraled into theater, half-truth, half-tremble. It didn't last. It didn't need to. Because the hairpin didn't win or lose. It simply outlived the panic. And now, as you find yourself back on the same street where this walk began, the fog curling around your ankles and the gas lamps sighing in the quiet, you realize that London is full of stories like this, stories sharp and silly, buried and bent, tucked behind lace curtains or braided into memory. They may not change the world, but they hold it in place just long enough for the rest of us to breathe. So here we are, at the edge of the fog, the city winding down like an old music box, each cobbled street and candlelit window clicking softly toward stillness. Your footsteps have slowed now. Your shoulders are heavier, not with worry, but with the quiet weight of a story well worn. The wind has died. The clock tower in the distance has stopped chiming. And the hum of London at rest begins to fold over you like a thick wool blanket. Maybe you've forgotten, just a little, where you are. That's okay. Because for a while tonight, you drifted through a world where small things meant big things. Where the tiny thread of steel hidden in a hairstyle could stir a courtroom or spark a poem. And maybe that's the real magic of history, not the kings and revolutions, but the quiet absurdities that held everyday life together. So now, let the pins slip out of place. Let the hair fall softly against your shoulders. Let your thoughts tangle into that gentle nowhere between sleep and dream. You've wandered far tonight, and there's nothing left to chase. Just the hush of gaslight. Just the memory of laughter echoing through fog. And just enough steel in the story to hold it all still while you rest. Good night.